All right, so a little bit, yeah, my background. Software engineer by training at Stanford. I've been at a whole bunch of different companies. It was early on at Trulia. Worked at Microsoft. This is my second startup. The first company, we raised a seed round of funding. It's called Pursuit of 500K. I called it a pity round because I was really bad at fundraising, and I ran around and people were like, this doesn't make any sense, but we like you, so we'll invest. And it turns out they were right, but there was a kernel of truth to it, and we got lucky in that we were able to sell it to Facebook as a talent acquisition. So I got to go through that process, and then started DocSend, primarily with the intent of getting rid of attachments, although I will say that the first use case for the technology was I would trade people a DocSend account in exchange for them using it for fundraising. And so, holiday parties, I run into VCs, they're all like, why have you created this thing, DocSend? I was like, I just wanted to see how much I could annoy VCs, and so this seemed like the best way of doing that, which is not entirely true. But this topic is actually near and dear to my heart, just fundraising, because it was so frustrating for me at Pursuit, and because it's so opaque, and because as an entrepreneur, the perception is that the investor has all the cards. And so it just feels kind of unfair. But it's also, it's almost like planning a wedding or something. You don't, hopefully a wedding is just once ever, but even for people who raised a lot of rounds of funding, it's still like a very rare event, and most people haven't raised money before. So maybe just a show of hands, how many people here are a founder of a startup? Okay, how many people have ever raised institutional investment before? Okay, a few, that's great. And how many of you think you'll ever need to raise outside capital? So, okay, all right, this is awesome. And then maybe just stage of company, raise a hand if you are a seed or earlier. Okay, great, awesome. It was like, we're all Series C companies. You're like, it's a different talk, but different challenges. Yeah, so for DocSend, we've got about 9,000 customers today. It primarily spreads via word of mouth and virally, although we do have a sales team. There are 40 of us. We raised a seed round, then we raised a venture debt round, then we raised a Series A, and then we raised what was effectively a Series B last year in November. And so, that's been, my own journey, and each round is totally different. And we'll come back to it at the end, but the information in this is from founders who have opted in to be part of this research. So if you use DocSend at some point and get an email from us in the future saying, hey, do you want to participate in research? Please say yes, because it's all anonymized and aggregate, but it's really helpful as a way just to give back and to help everyone else understand what on earth is going on here. So the other thing I'll say is that this data is on seed rounds specifically. There's also pre-seed, there's angel, there's like A, there's B, all sorts of different things. We focused on the seed round just because I think it's a really interesting kind of pivotal moment for companies where they're raising, $2-3 million bucks. So it starts to be like real money. It's not a friends and family round. But as an entrepreneur, you don't have a lot to show for it yet necessarily. Like, it's still like a dream, an idea. You've got maybe some early traction, but a lot of it is like you just being convincing to investors and weaving a good story. And so I always think of it as there's like the song and dance component of fundraising, where that is completely inside your control. Like, you can just be like awesome at telling a story and being very convincing. Then there's like the numbers side of it. One of our investors has a joke to the effect of like, no business plan ever like survives intact when it hits reality. Like, when you actually have to go off and start making revenue as a company. Like, so like for a Series B, you can be awesome at the song and dance part, but if you don't have the numbers to back it up, it's an entirely different game. But for the seed round, because you don't have numbers, that just puts so much more emphasis on like how you represent yourself. So the first is work smarter, not harder. The first time we went out and raised money, I thought that it's like the smart person fallacy. It's like, if I just work harder at this, it's gonna happen. And so it took me forever, and it eventually did, but it was hard. And I've realized since then that this is one of those things that's like not compensated for by just like sheer grit and more hours. Like, you need that, but like, just be thoughtful as you go through it. And then secondly, it's a long road, so just come prepared. I'm sure everyone here is like, yes, I'm taking it seriously with fundraising. And it's tough because you'll hear these stories like in TechCrunch or like from people where they're like, "Yeah, it took me 3 days to raise, $5 million in my seed round. It's like really easy." And then you're like, "Oh man, that should be me. Why is it so hard for me?" And if you do get lucky, and sometimes people do, like one of the first investor meetings you have is a good fit, they might give you a term sheet, it might snowball, that's great. It's just not something you can plan on. And so you really have to keep in mind your burn rate, how much time you have. I always say you need like 6 months of runway when you go out to raise, because you need 3 months to raise. And if you can't, you need 3 months to like figure out plan B for it. So make sure you leave enough time that's out there. And so just any preparation you put in before fundraising, you will absolutely, it's absolutely a good investment. You're not going to regret that time that you put in. All right, so with that in mind, the average pitch deck view. So you pour your life into this document, which is honestly kind of a weird just tradition that happens here, where you have the pitch deck and it's like, why do I need to create a separate pitch deck? I'm building a software product. But I mean, from the investor's point of view, they're trying to make sure that it makes sense to take that meeting, because if you're Uncork, they invest in 0.1% of the deals they see. And so the pitch deck is how you represent yourself. It's how you represent your company. It gives them insight into how you think about things. And then they'll take the meeting or not based on that and some of the other factors they can find about you. And so the average pitch deck view is 3 minutes and 44 seconds. How many people here think that's a long time? How many people here think it's a short time? So they're more on the short end than the long end. I wasn't sure what this number would be. It feels short in a sense that like 3 minutes and 44 seconds, I've spent so much time on this. In actuality, it's pretty long, and the decks that raise the most money the fastest actually have very short view times. It's like more time spent is not necessarily a good thing, which is another like oddity in my own head. But that's what it is, 3 minutes and 44 seconds. So like as you're putting it together, just remember like it's not even something, they're gonna spend less than 5 minutes like flip, going through your deck and then like judging you for that. So don't bother with big walls of text, or like, just keep that in mind, is like that's the average attention span for an investor looking through this sort of thing. This is a whole bunch of stuff on one slide. So what we do for this research is we'll send people a survey where they'll answer questions about how long did it take you, when did you start, when did you stop, like how many people did you pitch, and like all of this like kind of other information that we as DocSend don't have, obviously. And then they also allow us to look at their pitch decks to understand like what's in them, what were the viewing behaviors, and try to like draw information out of that. So for a seed round, kind of on average across hundreds of companies at this point that are in the data set, 58 investors contacted, 40 investor meetings, and meetings can be repeat. It's not just 40 first meetings. It might be you met 3 times with one investor. 1.3 million raised for a seed round. That is trending up over time, and so you've got the pre-seed that's coming in where you're raising like 500K. And then seed rounds can be like a bit bigger, and the seed funds themselves are reflecting this. Like Uncork, their average check size has definitely gone up over the last few years. And then 12.5 weeks from start to finish in terms of like time to close. So when I say like budget 3 months for it, that's like on average. You can make it a little bit faster, I think, if you are planned to know what you're doing, but this is the average amongst this data set. And then in terms of the decks themselves, 19 pages. I personally think that's a little long, but it varies. It shouldn't be 30, though, if you're putting together your deck and it's like, all the 45 pages in here, I need all of them. I'd be like, well, it might be true, but remember, 3 minutes, 44 seconds, and you're way off the average. And so that's kind of like what it looks like for like a seed raise in terms of like overall process. So the good news is that, hey, you can quantify it. 58 investors, that's not that many. We could probably knock that out in an afternoon. We'll put together the deck. It's 19 pages. I had a high school project where I had to do a PowerPoint, and it's another afternoon. So when you put the numbers up there, yeah, it should be fine. It should be easy. And I'll answer this question. Should a pitch deck be designed to be easily understood without a spoken presentation or support the spoken presentation? Okay, so it shouldn't, like, does it have to stand on its own? And the answer is like, yes. Some people have multiple pitch deck versions, like I've got the send ahead, which doesn't need a voiceover, and they've got the separate deck that like requires the voiceover. I've only ever used the one that doesn't require a voiceover, because if it's like a good meeting and they like it, when you get into the meeting, it's gonna be a discussion. It's not gonna be you like standing up Like if this was me like pitching you for money, this would be going very poorly because everyone is just sitting there silently like staring at me. And so a good investor meeting is one where it's a debate. So the deck you send ahead of time does need to stand on its own and tell a narrative, tell a story. So what we've got on this page here is showing. So we used Sequoia's business plan advice and categorized all the decks in this set to for each slide, which category does that slide fall under. And then we looked at, okay, amongst all these decks, and these are only the successful decks, by the way, that we were looking at. There are a lot of people who, when they respond to the survey, they, it's useful, but they also say, like, I failed to fundraise. And so we just were looking at successful decks. So we categorized them, and then we broke them out. And what I was trying to figure out was, like, what is in the average deck? Like, so one interesting thing is, like, the only category of slide where 100% of the companies had it was the team slide, which I guess makes sense for a seed round of funding, right? There's like no one out there who's like raising a round of funding for something that doesn't have a team, so you got to have the team slide. But interesting that nothing else had 100%. The closest was product at 96%, and I'd actually say the product is, well, we'll get to it in a minute, but that is actually less relevant if the seed round, or it can be less relevant. And then there's also in here the number of if a deck had this category of page in it, how many pages on average were in that category. So you can see that for the product ones, there's 5 slides on average if someone has a product slide at all, which is actually a lot, versus competition at 1.4, team at 1.2, and then like something else like solution 1.2. And so this just kind of is what it is. So as you're sitting down and looking at like what's the composition of my deck, what should I put in there? Just something to keep in mind, and we'll come around to like what one should put in there, but this is just a nice baseline in terms of like what is in there on average. And then we'll get around to financial projections too. I have lots of thoughts on that. All right, so this is really fun too. So this is, the previous one was like what is in a deck on average, and this isn't like what I think should or shouldn't be. That's just like what is there, and this also is, in my opinion, this is like where do people spend the most time like reading in the deck if the deck has that category of page. And so what we can see here is that for financials, only 58% of companies had financials. Also, I should note that financials includes a mix of like actual financials as well as like traction. Like if you're like, have a graph of like new user signups or beta signups or like usage or something like that, we bucketed that into financials as well. But for a seed round, like you often like don't have a lot of like traction or financials in general. So it's actually a lot of people who put it in there, in my opinion. And if you do put it in there, it's going to be the thing that people look at the longest. So just remember, that's what's going to be scrutinized. Make sure you're going to go touch up a page in your deck. Make sure you touch up like kind of in this order: financials, team, competition. I mean, kind of surprisingly, solution is like way down on the list. So yeah, this kind of is like why now, company purpose, business model, product, market size. These are all like pretty self-explanatory, I think, in terms of like what's in them. But again, it's just the Sequoia business plan template, which if you Google that, it's up on Sequoia's website, so you can see what these like categories in more depth. So this one I actually really enjoy. So this is comparing successful decks with failure decks, which I think is like, we learn a lot from failure. We also learn a lot from failure as you compare it to not failure. And like what happened, what was different. And so that was a question I had in my mind, which is like, is there anything in like the decks themselves that comes up? Because for every entrepreneur that responded to the survey saying like they failed to raise money, that's kind of heartbreaking. Like there's just so much effort and time that went into that. Like no one starts a company, is out there fundraising, and like doesn't believe 100% in what they're doing. And so the question is like, well, is there anything we can learn about this that for us, those of us who are planning to go through it, that we can like learn from them in aggregate. And the problem I found a lot is when I just talk anecdotally to other entrepreneurs, if it's worked for them, they'll say, this is what I did, you should do this too. And if it didn't work for them, they'll say like, I failed, and this is why, so don't do that. The problem is every company is entirely different, so someone's failure story is perhaps not relevant to me, or their success story. So there are a lot of ways to interpret this, right? Because you get the data, and then you're like, but what does it mean? And it's like, this is the data. So I can tell you the story I have around this. So the red bars are the failed decks. It's hard to, I get that it's hard to read here. So what we'll say here, so this is team and this is product, and this is company purpose. And then, we have over here market size, and then we have, financials. So we already talked about, financials being, more time spent in general. But you'll notice in the failure decks, people really focused a lot more time on team, product, and financials. And I thought the product one was especially interesting because the failure decks also had a lot more pages on product. And so as I was looking through, some of these decks and, just trying to get a sense for like, why could that be the case? And I also found myself reading the page for a lot longer. And the same thing happens whenever, if, a friend of a friend is, raising and they need advice, I'll be looking through their deck. And the decks that make a lot of sense, I kind of like go through them pretty quickly. And then if there's, all right, we're back. If there's something that doesn't make sense to me, then I stop and I spend more time looking at it. And so for them, it shouldn't be interpreted as like, I love this page so much that I'm spending a ton of time here. It's like I'm spending a lot of time on this page because I don't know what I'm looking at, or I disagree with it, or it causes confusion. So the successful decks had much less of a variance. It is much more flip, 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 flip. And the best decks that raise the most money the fastest, like those decks, when you read them, it just seems obvious. It's like an obvious narrative. Or it's like, you hear like the Uber story and you're like, gosh, that's the world's most obvious company. Like, why wasn't that done earlier? And so for a good deck, that's what you come away with. By the way, Uber had such a hard time raising their seed round of funding. They went up and down Sand Hill. And so the funny thing about that is every investor who missed out on that, they all had the chance. Pinterest is the same, where they really had a tough time early on raising money. And so they pitched everyone. And so they just left a sea of regret behind them for both Uber and for Pinterest. And so they didn't seem as obvious early on when they made their deck, but they figured out and were great businesses. And now the narrative they tell, like in retrospect, feels really obvious to us. But the trick is when you're early on, putting together a narrative that seems obvious. And it's kind of different for every company. It's a bit of a puzzle. It really comes down to storytelling. But let's just say you're a technical founder, like I'm building this awesome product, and I'm the only person on the planet that can build it, and we're going to raise money. What I want to do is I want to show the investors like this amazing product that I've built. So I'm going to have a bunch of pages with screenshots or like making it look really complicated. And it might be the case that you are the only person on the planet who can build this product. The VC will probably sit there and be like, but why do I care? Like, there are a lot of things that can be built, but why this? So it really requires a mental shift. So if you have too much like time in your deck spent on the product and they're spending too much time there, it's because they don't know what they're looking at and they're trying to figure it out. Same with the team. If it's like why this team, like this is super random, like you're going into machine learning and you are an English major or something, like I need a little bit more about why the team is relevant. And same with the financials. If you don't have good traction numbers, if you don't have like financials, and I think everyone at the seed stage like doesn't have good financials, like startups are basically an exercise in losing money until you figure it out later, which doesn't look good if you put that on a graph or show your financials. Actually, funny story for DocSend, the very first accountant we hired after we raised our seed round, he like came to me and he's like, I don't know, we had a call and he's like, it's kind of awkward, I don't know how to describe this to you, but it just looks like you're losing money. I was like, yes, that's exactly what we're doing. He's like, but how will you make a business out of this? And I was like, you know what? I think this might not be a good fit. He hadn't worked at a startup before. So we found another accountant, and then he had a call with him. He's like, I don't think you're losing money fast enough. That's what you want from your accountant, because that's like what you're trying to do. And so, yeah, success decks versus failure decks, like keep that in mind. And another thing about ordering, like you do want to put the things in the order that makes you look the best. If your team is awesome, put that first. If your story about like why now or why me, and you're like really passionate about it, like put that up first. If the thing people always come back to when you're talking about it is like, is this a very big market or this just seems like super niche, then like that's the thing you need to start out with. Because you basically, as soon as you lose someone, if like you're going through the deck or they're reading through the deck in their head, they're like, yeah, this just seems like a tiny market. They're like not even absorbing other information until you answer that question to them. So don't feel like for your own company, you need to follow like the overall advice. Like you might be in a situation that's pretty different, and so you should order things differently. And that's the feedback loop that can happen. And it'll also be different, like how you pitch in person versus how you put it in the deck. The purpose of the deck is to get you into the meeting. And in the meeting, then you need to, kind of go through the narrative of the story and like really, really sell it. So another thing that I thought that was interesting is the number of decks that have why now and why yes slides. And I think these are like two of the most overlooked like categories of slides. And so looking at success versus failure decks, the success decks just had those pages like significantly more than the failed decks. So if you're in doubt, I would definitely recommend putting in like why now and why us slides. They don't have to say that on them. Like the title of the slide can be the answer to that question. But you should address that, because having a narrative around it. I mean, the other thing you'll have is if you answer those well in your deck and you get the meeting, they might be like, well, what's your defensible moat, or like other questions like this. But you do need to have an answer to these, and the failed decks didn't address those questions as often, and I think that's to their detriment. Another thing I thought was interesting, like failed versus success decks, is that it's not the case that someone viewing your deck for longer is a good thing. It is the case that the more time someone comes back to your deck, like that correlates with them investing and you like actually raising money successfully. And that kind of makes sense, right? You send them the deck, they look through it, they're like, interesting. You have the meeting, they go back and they look at it later. They talk to a partner, they come back and look at it later. Like people will just actually come back to your deck more often, and then you might just see them flip to page 8 and look at that for a while and then leave. And they come back and come to page 3, but like it just tells you they're actually thinking about it more. And so like the additional touch points, like that interest is just indicative of like it's going well for you. So just another thing to keep in mind. This is a huge difference in terms of the total number of views of the decks in the successful ones versus the failed ones. So this one I like a lot because it kind of holds true to me in terms of it makes sense logically and emotionally, but I really like having data to say it's not just my opinion, but it appears to be generally true. And so this is the old quality, not quantity for investor intros. And so on the left, we've got investor meetings on this axis versus investors contacted. And so you can kind of see there is like a general correlation. If you contact more investors, you will get more meetings. So that's good. That's nice. But then on the right, we have the money offered and investors contacted. So same x-axis, different y-axis. And you can see here there's absolutely like no correlation between the amount of money you're offered and the number of investors you contact. And I say money offered because in our surveying, we'll ask people, how much did you raise, but then also how much you offered. Because there's a dynamic that happens with pretty regularly where, especially for seed funding, if you get like a professional investor to lead your round, and so for instance, if Uncork was going to give you a term sheet, they'll typically give you a term sheet for half the round of funding, and then they'll ask other people to fill out the rest of the round of funding. When you get to Series A and B, the investor wants the whole round for themselves. But for seed round, for whatever reason, like they'll do that and they have half open, and then you can go fill that in. And let's just say you've met some really great people, or you have some advisors, or you can choose who you let in, or they'll help you fill it out. And so you'll get in the situation where a lot of people want to invest, and so you actually get more money than you have room for, and that's what it's called when you're like oversubscribed in your round of funding. And so that's why we're looking at the total amount of money offered for companies, because a lot of the ones that raised successfully had like way more money offered to them than they had room for. And what you as a founder don't want to do is you don't want to like take all of the money, because then you'll like dilute yourself more than you need to. And in the game of dilution, the real trick is not like how much you give up in each round. Like giving up 20% versus 25% for your seed round, not that material. If you need to raise like a bridge round or a seed plus round, that's another 20%. So you actually want to minimize the number of rounds you raise, not like how much you give up in a given round. And you want to make sure you take enough money to get to the next stage so you don't get kind of stuck in the middle. But you don't want to take so much that you're just diluting yourself for like no reason. So anyway, that's how that works for that. And so, my takeaway from this was, like, if you can get 30 meetings with investors, that should give you a pretty good signal. If you get no's from 30 people and they're warm intros and they like really take a look at it and they listen to you, you should not do another 30 investors after that. I think there's like either you're bad at pitching, maybe it's not a good idea, maybe you just need to make some progress in some way, maybe you need to turn around and like adjust your narrative. But like take the feedback, like iterate and try again, don't just do another. another 30, because again, quality, not quantity. We had some people in this data set who contacted like 500 investors. They had like hired an intern just to contact people. And I emailed them and be like, did you really contact that many people? They're like, yes. And I was like, would you recommend other people do that? And they said, no, I would not recommend other people do that. This is not a good idea. I was just trapped. I didn't know what I was doing. And I got like, kind of desperate. Another important point is only you can raise money. Like the CEO has to raise money for the company. That's just the way it is. Your lawyer can't really help you. An advisor can't really help you. Like you have to go pitch on your own. And for a lot of startups, if you're a technical like founder and CEO, it's kind of like early sales. As a founder, you also have to do that. There are a lot of things, like whoever you are in like starting and building a company, you have to do that aren't necessarily your like first choice of job, but it's like, well, you get to do it because there's no one else. So you got to go out and raise money, even if it's not a thing you like doing. So yeah, and in terms of like teeing up the 30 meetings, what I generally advise, especially for the seed round, is to ask someone who is kind of at the next level, like a Series A or B investor, who is not going to invest, but see if you can get their time and practice with them, because they'll give you real feedback. An actual seed investor will not give you real feedback because they're actually thinking if they want to invest or not. And if the answer is no, they'll be like, oh, not now, or let's keep in touch, which is not useful to you. Series A investor might actually take the time to give you some honest feedback, hoping that you do raise a seed round, hoping that it might go well for you, and then hoping you'll remember this favor they did you and actually take your money in the event that it's like an oversubscribed or competitive round. And so that advice can be like really great. So get that advice, iterate on the deck, and when you set up your meetings, those 30 meetings, like squash them into as short a time frame as possible. Like another thing we saw in the kind of data here, which is another thing I'd love to do some more research on, is just like the dynamic of like a round that closes really quickly. And so we'll come back to that in a bit, but like what you want to do is you need to create a sense of urgency amongst investors. This is like why going through Y Combinator is so great. You have demo day, and everyone knows it's like it's going to be a mess coming in. So how do I create that sense of urgency on my own if I don't have like a demo day? Okay, so the question, what's your take on VCs asking for your slide deck to circulate internally during their decision-making process, both before or after a face-to-face meeting? I think that usually most people turn off downloading ahead of a meeting face-to-face. If you have a face-to-face meeting and they actually seem genuinely interested in it, yeah, you can just let them turn on downloading. It's not like that big of a deal to let them have the deck. So yeah, it's like even for our investors, I turn on downloading. It's still just, and that really only applies in like if you're using DocSend, because other systems usually just always have downloading on. But yeah, don't overstress about like letting them have the deck. The thing is, I don't like people to have my deck if they didn't take time to meet with me, and if I don't think they're actually interested in it. And so if there is like a partnership, you need to pitch that partnership, like your main point of contact might want to repurpose your deck and put it together in an investment memo, and it's a pretty common workflow for investors. And so, yeah, let them have the local copy. It's not a big deal. And this one is, the data about time spent could be misleading. Financial slides could be simply more difficult to understand. Does that make them more important? That's a good question, because if you have like a traction slide or like, so because financials in this research could either be traction or actual financials, if you're putting actual financials in there, it's really not needed to get the first meeting. Like someone shouldn't be deciding to meet or not meet with you because of your financials, which are just going to be like you're spending money. And if you put traction in there, that can be hard. It's a pretty rare startup that can raise a seed round based just on their traction numbers. The way I like to present traction numbers is a little different, and the way I see other entrepreneurs do that well, where you pitch them on the idea, the opportunity, why us, why now, like evidence that you've got around it, and then the new traction is kind of like, and by the way, we've got some number of people, like for DocSend seed round, we didn't have any users, but we had done a bunch of interviews. And so we actually just had a bunch of like quotes from people about their problems. And we basically were like, hey, we're a good team, we'll be able to build it. And by the way, we just spent a bunch of time interviewing like 30 people. And so here's our belief based on those 30 interviews. And so that wasn't like a traction slide. We couldn't have like interviews over time. So I still think that if someone spends a lot of time looking at something, like they're just not sure what they're looking at. And if it's a really dense information wall that just doesn't belong in what's up front, there are other materials people ask for after your first meeting where people actually read through it more, like if you actually give them a financial model or something like that. And so those can require more attention. But with this is financials in the sense of it's in a pitch deck being used to get you your first meeting, which I think is a little bit more specific. Okay, so I'll kind of skip over this. I won't go through this in a whole lot of detail. How many people know the difference between angels and seed firms? Oh, good. Okay, well, I'll cover it then. So the angels can be full-time. They can be professional investors, but they're just investing their own money. They can be part of a syndicate, but often they're just kind of on their own. Let's say I just have so much free time and so much money that I just want to go invest in startups, most of which will fail, but one might make it big. And so there are a lot of people who are in that bucket. They're angels. Seed firms are people who are doing it full-time. They're investing other people's money. They have a fund. Seed firms have a lot more money at their disposal. So like Uncork, they led our Series C, thank you. And Jeff Clavier started that fund. He's the managing director there. They have increased their fund size over time. I think it started off at like 40. I think it's closer to 100 now or something. And when they put money in, they usually put in at least $1 million, and they try to take half the round. So it's come up from like 750 to like $1 million. And so there are pros and cons to both of these categories. Angels will often see fewer deals. They might have an expertise that's closer to relevant to you and what your business is doing. However, you need a lot more of them to put together a seed round. So I think they make sense for pre-seed or for like a friends and family. If you're doing your initial 50K or even a 500K round, then angels can be fine for that. There are also like pre-seed firms like Precursor Ventures that focus on that. But then the seed firms for like you're actually going to raise like a couple $1 million. Well, we'll just go to the next one. The answer is that seed firms are better. Like if you have the choice between the two, go with the seed firm versus an angel-led round. Because in our data set, there are a lot of companies that would raise on convertible notes. And so that means it's not a priced round. That means you're just putting together a bunch of checks from angels in, like using the YC paper, or their like safe notes, or there are a few other options for that. And you're kind of you're putting the round together yourself. Sometimes entrepreneurs like that because there's the impression that they keep more control. Like they don't have a board. It's not a priced round, so that means like you don't actually need to give up the equity today, and so you can kind of keep control, which is totally true. And if you go with a seed firm and they're giving, actually doing like a $2 million round, they might require a board seat. They might actually, it will be priced. They will get the equity. They'll have preferred stock. They'll have their rights. And you as an entrepreneur have a little less control. Like they have information rights. Like you need to actually send them updates and stuff, which is overhead, which is true. But in terms of like looking at the characteristics of startups that have a seed firm versus an angel-led round, the seed firm is going to be faster. So they see a lot more pitch decks, so their bar is a lot higher, but if they like something, they move really fast because this is their full-time job. Their only job is to give away money, invest money. But the number of investors contacted, drastically fewer as well. The average number of meetings, way fewer. The amount of money raised, way higher. And the amount oversubscribed, way, way higher. And so the dynamic, and then the dollar per contact is another thing we looked at. Like if you're sitting there like contacting people, getting meetings, and you successfully raise your dollar per per investor contacted is way higher if you end up being funded by a seed firm. So my advice is always to raise from a seed firm first if you can, and if you can't, then put together like an angel round of potentially smaller size, and then try again later to go hit that milestone and raise a larger amount of money. Okay, well, this is did you find any patterns for what makes a bad team slide? What wouldn't make sense about a team page? Well, that's a good one. We'll come back to that one in a minute. So in terms of getting into like seed firms, And what you want to do there, you want to have your meetings in like a 2-week window if possible. And week 1 can be your like tier B or your angels. And then week 2 can be the like seed firms or the ones you're more serious about. Because what will happen is if you sandwich 30 meetings into a 2-week period, you're going to be spending all of your time pitching. Like you're not going to get any other work done, so just set it aside. But that's way better than spending like 6 months kind of fundraising, which is what I did for my first company. And so you want to like raise or not raise and then get back to work. And so do all your practicing in the first week. For angels, people who might join the round. You'll get a lot of maybes, you'll get some no's, but your pitch will evolve a lot. Because you remember you're sending your deck out, you're getting these meetings, and you're actually pitching in the meeting, and you're having these debates, and you're figuring out like what are the weak points are. So like from a team perspective, it might be the case that it's like what about your team is impressive, and it's like, okay, well we don't have any name brand schools, or I need to put up my experience there in a way, because that's the first question I get in person is like this, like, oh, and so that maybe that I'm not putting my best foot forward on the team page, so maybe I need to describe myself differently. And then sometimes it's usually just lack of information that makes for a bad team page. It's like hastily put together, and like, no, you should link off to your LinkedIn profile from the team page, and you should explain your experience and why it's relevant to this particular company that you're starting. And so then you practice the first week. The second week you have your seed firm or your seed fund meetings, and those are the important ones. And what will typically happen is if you have a good first meeting, they will, depending on this level of the person you talk to, you might have to pitch a second partner, and you might have to go pitch their partnership. And so usually these meetings are on Monday. You might go in and pitch the meeting, the partnership meeting on Monday, and if they like it, they'll usually give you a term sheet that night, because they're used to acting quickly, because if they don't act quickly, someone else is going to act quickly. And so it can happen pretty quickly. And if it doesn't, then you can go back and maybe raise unconvertible notes and stuff like that. Another thing to keep in mind, just how quickly the winds of fortune can change from like one bucket to another. For DocSend, we did all our pitching the first week, and we got a lot of maybes, got a lot of no's. We were like, oh, I might put in 25K. We're like, okay. We went through the second week, and then we met with Jeff from Uncork, and within a couple of days, he'd like given us a term sheet. We're like, whoa. But they was like kind of at the end of our list. We got a lot of maybes. And so we went back and messaged everyone else saying like, hey, we got a term sheet, so if you want to join, let me know. And we got a lot of people who were like, oh, wow, oh, I thought it was like okay, but I guess if they're moving on it, then I'm definitely in. And so people got back to me saying like, yo, yeah, I'm in. And so I kind of looked at the numbers, and it's like, oh, we have money to fill out the round. So a lot of maybes went to yeses as well. And so then I email everyone and I say, looks like we have enough money for this round. But we haven't picked everyone yet. So if you would like to be included, please let me know why we should take your money. And that was absolutely hysterical to watch. Like that would happen. People who were like, I might put in 25K, could be like, I have to have at least $300,000 in this deal, or it's just not worth my time to be involved. So it's like, just keep that in mind as you're off like pitching and running around. Like you can be like down one day, and then the next day you're like, oh my God, I had this crazy oversubscribed round. And so it can really change quickly. And so just, go easy on yourself as you're. In order to get an investor meeting, do you suggest sending an executive summary or a full pitch deck? Well, these things are always fluid, so I'm not entirely sure what an executive summary would entail. If it's a long, like business plan-ish document, that's just not the social norm in Silicon Valley or in New York. In Israel, actually, there is more of a culture of sending like one-pagers as like your overview deck, so that's a little bit different there. But typically, it's a pitch deck because people just flip through them pretty quickly. It needs to be somewhat visual. If it's a big wall of text, I have not seen that work very well for people. And then in terms of like what constitutes like a full pitch deck, it just needs to be the information needed to get the meeting. Sometimes people have all the appendix pages in there, and like that can be fine. It's not going to like hurt you to have them all in there. If there's anything that's like really sensitive, don't put it in there. Also, if there's anything that's just confusing in the narrative, don't put it in there. I think the most important thing about the pitch deck you use to get the meeting is that it constitutes an interesting narrative that leaves them wanting more, and they want to meet with you. So I like this one around how long does it take to raise, because I feel like we're all kind of like judging ourselves or comparing ourselves to others. It's like, oh, this other company it took them 4 days. So is that normal? It's not normal, but like how much better than average is that? And so we found the bulk of companies fell in like the 11 to 15 week range. And then 17% were 16 weeks and above. And so if you get to 16 weeks, so that's 4 months in, you haven't raised. Remember, the 16%, 70% of companies will still raise at that period of time, but you're kind of in the less likely zone, and hence the my advice around you pitch 30 people and get to know quickly. Stop, like change something, and try again in 3 months. And what you'll actually find is that a lot of investors will say, like, even though you just changed your narrative or something, you're like, man, you've made so much progress in the last 3 months. This is so impressive. And then you get in. So it's actually fine if you get a no and then you pitch someone again later. Maybe they're thinking about it. Maybe the market's changed, but don't write people off. And then 0 to 5 weeks, 15%. There are a lot of people in the data set who are either repeat entrepreneurs or have relationships with investors from beforehand. There's like a school of thought around like getting to know investors over a longer period of time. That can certainly help in fundraising. I don't think it's required. And then, yeah, there are some people who definitely just have like an unfair advantage. Like, so the first time I was raising for Pursuit, really hard. The second time for DocSend, just having a track record made a huge difference. So just keep that in mind. It's never personal, but there are people, if you're multiple time founder, it does get easier and you're more of a known quantity to them. And so, yeah, 11 to 15 weeks, totally fine. You can run your process and it'll take a few months, make sure you have enough cash to like get you through it, but that's kind of like the normal range of how long that takes. So this is another one that we looked at recently, which is like, when do people actually raise during the year? And because there's this kind of anecdotal like advice I got around like, all VCs travel in August. I'm like, is that true? I guess ours don't. But it's like the summer is really hard, or it's like. So I was kind of wondering like, when do people actually raise? And so this isn't like when people announce. This is like we can see like the activity of people sending pitch decks, and then VCs when they actually read them. Because we have a lot of use cases for DocSend. So we have a lot of sales teams, marketing teams, customer success. A lot of VCs use DocSend for their fundraising. And so we just narrowed this down to like startup fundraising and like when is that activity happening. And the assumption here is that when VCs are actually looking at decks, that's like very close to when they're deciding. And so it's interesting that you can kind of see there are 3 months where like the visits, like visiting decks, like peaks, October, November, and then March. And the summer is kind of, but sure enough, August is kind of a low month. So like maybe there's something there to that. But looking at this, a couple of my takeaways was like, yeah, December is a bad month. And there seems to be a flurry of activity in November. And then like December is bad. So you kind of like miss the window. And so like don't fundraise in December, which I think makes sense, but I'm like, it seems to be true. And then, there's like March is when things pick back up again. And it's kind of interesting. You can see the like links being sent kind of peaking in October and then falling off dramatically, and investors like looking at things like peaking in November. So I just, in my head, I see a bunch of entrepreneurs in October being like, got to make the cut for this, sending out the decks, and then investors being, yeah, I'll get to it later. And then in November, they're like, uh-oh, I'm going on vacation. I gotta make one more investment this year. Like looking through the decks real quick to see if there's something they want to invest in. And then like January is just like, I think everyone is just recovering or something, or they're just kind of hanging out. There's not a lot going on. But interestingly enough, the decks that are sent in January and February, like from the entrepreneur perspective, you're actually going to get the most attention on those decks. And so I do think it's generally true that a lot of investors are coming back from the holiday feeling like refreshed. January is kind of a slow month, but the decks that are sent get the most attention. So if you're going to raise, if you have the chance of raising during the year, I actually think January is like a great month. Like everyone else is still like trying to put their process together, get their deck together. Like if you do that over the holiday and get your meeting set up right in January, I think that's a great time to fundraise. Investors will often do, depending on like their setup, they're not doing that many investments every year, but a lot of them do come back in January being like, okay, let's go. Like I'm looking for a deal. So anyway, my 2 cents on this. But really, people raise throughout the year, so there's not really, other than December, like a terrible time to raise. But you are going to be, if you're raising in March or October, November, you are going to be kind of in the peak season of like, there's just a lot of stuff going on out there. So keep that in mind. A lot of times investors don't get back to you, but it's not personal. They just get really busy. And they get so many decks, and they're investing in like 0.1% of the companies they see. And so it's hard for them to be like, super personal with everything. So if you raise a seed round successfully, congratulations, that's great. You have Series A coming up next. So like, you have to go do it again. And one of the things that I liked about, like, because we have like a lot of like Series A data as well, which we could probably do a deeper dive into at some point. But what was good about this is, or at least from an entrepreneur perspective, if you are able to successfully raise a Series A, and there's a huge drop-off, right, from seed to A. Like most seed companies, like don't make it to A. So, you know, pat yourself on the back if you get your seed round and raise, but like start thinking about like, what do I need to like get the next round of funding, and like start thinking about that like pretty quickly. And if you are able to raise it, the nice thing is that it'll take you less time. You'll talk to fewer investors, you'll have fewer meetings, and you'll get more money. And so these are all like lovely characteristics, like should you be able to get through the gauntlet of raising a Series A. Yeah, but like the ratio of like C deals to A deals is just like super different. And what we're also seeing is that Series A, all the rounds are becoming more flexible. Like the private equity companies are coming further down market and are getting in earlier at companies, and then kind of like seed rounds are getting bigger, and so then A rounds are becoming bigger. And so you do see a lot of fluctuation in the amount of capital raised for Series A, which I think is something we should dive into in more detail. Oh, well, VCs accept a person talking through their deck as a video. So it could be a 3-minute video, but with founder talking over it. I think I've heard of a few people doing that. It's possible. I don't know. Actually, I think that's a great question. I have heard of some VCs who will give feedback to entrepreneurs in video form. So they'll just use Zoom and they'll record themselves like talking about the deck as they go through it, because that's like faster for them than like writing notes. So I've heard of video feedback more often than like the video deck being sent. Yeah, and if it was exactly 3 minutes, like, I don't know, like our seed deck was only viewed for like 2 minutes and 20 seconds or something on average each time, because the deck again seemed pretty obvious. Flip, 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 done. I'll take the meeting. And so they have to sit through a whole video. I don't know. But I think it's a great question, so maybe I'll keep an eye out for that, and that could be something we look into more. And so here are like 6 takeaways, if you will, around just like what's to keep in mind, because I know there's a lot of stuff in here. So like, common practice, have a deck, maybe video, but probably at least for now, deck is safe. 20 or fewer pages. Remember, people are going to go through it relatively quickly, so try to keep it straightforward and like easy to understand. You know, raising a round is going to take potentially longer than you think. Yeah, but budget a few months for it. Make sure you get through 30 meetings or so. But just keep these timelines in mind and like kind of emotionally brace yourself for the process. If you, as you're going through like who do I raise from for a seed round, try to definitely go to the seed firms to see if you can get around from them. Use the angels first as practice, and then go to the seed firms. It'll just make your life a lot easier. Also on the topic of like having a board versus having convertible notes. If you have a board, it'll make it easier to raise a Series A, because the Series A firm, if they like you a lot, if you don't have any oversight, they'll be wondering like, is what you're doing, like, are you actually representing it to me like accurately or not? Because like you have no oversight, so I don't know. Versus if, and all the seed investors know all the Series A investors, so if you've got a seed investor on your board and you're raising Series A, they could be really helpful back channeling for you. And the Series A investor knows it's like kind of de-risked, because it's like, oh, this seed investor is on their board. They have a board. That's nice. They have regular updates, so like they must be relatively well run. And so it'll actually save you a huge headache in your Series A. So one argument in favor, like just give someone a board seat, have board meetings, and you just have some fixed overhead now. But yeah, so raise from a firm if possible. More meetings does not equal more money, quality over quantity. Contact 20 to 30 investors, but you're not going to contact hundreds. That's not going to help you in any way. And then in terms of like your deck, make sure your team slide looks great. Make sure you're putting your best foot forward in terms of like how we represent ourselves, who are we and why are we the team that should be doing this. And then if you do include any data around finances or traction, be thoughtful about how you represent that, just because it is something that people will likely focus on a lot. And if it doesn't support your overall narrative in a way, maybe just leave it out. You don't have to put everything in there. The other thing I was going to cover for like 2 minutes, I think turning fundraising into fundraising is probably not possible, but we try to take the edge off a little bit. So the reason people use DocSend for this process is that they will have, every investor will get a unique link to their deck, and they'll be able to see how long each person looks at each page and who they forward it to. And on the investing side, if they get a DocSend link, they know they can't like they'll ask to download it because they might want to send it to another firm that's got a competitive investment or something. You don't want them to do that, so that's why people usually turn off downloading until they've had an in-person meeting and feel okay about them. But when you're trying to get 30 meetings, knowing who's actually looking through it or not can be super helpful, and what they care about. And you'll also be able to see hotspots in terms of like everyone's spending a lot of time on this page. Remember, that's probably not flattery. That's probably like, I might need to update that page or figure out what's going on there. And then yeah, this is the forwarding. It's just easy to see who they're forwarding to. So it's a really good sign if you meet with a partner and they forward your deck to the rest of their firm. People only do that when they're excited about something. They don't forward things to their colleagues when they're like, we're definitely not going to invest in this, just wanted to confirm with you all. So like that is like a really exciting moment when you see that happen. And then turning off access, like it's your deck, it's your information. So you've got a dashboard of who you've sent it to and you can just turn them off immediately. And then there's this really great feature where if someone tries to go back to it afterwards, you're notified. So this like, investor X who turned you down 4 months ago is trying to look at your deck again. Ha ha ha. We've already raised and you missed out. And then updating it. As these things are pretty fluid, it can be frustrating to figure out like who's looked at which versions and when. And so it's also nice to like sandwich it all into a 2-week period so you do your iterating ahead of time. But people use DocSend just because you can update it and then every link you've ever sent is updated, but you can still see which versions people looked at, which can be useful as you're trying to, it just looks silly when you're like, oh, I sent them the old version and I've iterated it so much I should send them the new version. So you send them a new version and they're like, so what was in the old version? And now they have both versions, they can look at them both. And you're like, oh no, just ignore the old version. And so this way it's a little bit better because then they don't have the old version anymore. And then we also have a feature called Spaces that is a data room where, especially for later stage fundraising, you will get a lot of data requests where it's like, oh, this looks good, send me these other 8 files. And so you need to put them somewhere. So we have a feature where you can combine all your documents into one little nice web page, and you get all the same security on it and can see who they're forwarding it to and what they're engaging with, which is great. This also gets used a lot in M&A, which is with a whole other like talk we could probably have around like just representing your company if you ever are fortunate enough to be acquired. So I think we've got some time for questions, and we'll turn it over there. But at least for me, one thing I'll say is that like supporting the startup community is just something I do because I like it a lot, and I believe it really provides a huge benefit to the world at large, that we're taking a ton of risks to try to do these things to make it better. So I mean, just use DocSend for free for 6 months if you want to. We'd love to have you use it for fundraising. It's not something we make money off of, but it's really nice software for this particular use case. So encourage you all to try it out.
So you could leave any PDF document as well as PowerPoint?
The question was any PDF or PowerPoint. Yeah, you can give DocSend like a PowerPoint, Keynote, a PDF, and then it's just web viewable. And so it's really nice. You can look at things on your phone. I've actually been live presenting this the whole time. So if you go to docsend.com/Russ, it's just on my phone and I'm like flipping through slides. So whenever I go to a partner meeting, if someone is phoning in from somewhere else, I'll live present so they can go to my deck and they can follow along as I'm like actually walking through the deck, should it be one of those things where there's a deck. So for Q&A, I don't know how this works. Well, let's see. So I think, let me see which ones I didn't get to. Typical, oh, I see. Latest question. I'm sorry, I've never used this before, so my bad. I promise I'm good at software sometimes. What is a typical team size? Would an investor shy away from a single person team? Yeah, investors vary on this point. I do think if you're just the one founder, it depends on how like awesome and impressive you are. It also depends on like how technical you are, because you kind of need to embody everything, especially if it's your first round, you don't have employees or something. But if you like bootstrapped it or you had a small round and you're able to put together the rest of the team, the later you get as a single founder, the less it matters that you are a single founder. But the typical team size is like 2 to 4. I mean, the other thing I've heard from investors is it can be bad to have too many co-founders. Like one investor was telling me, he's like, yeah, every time we get pitched by a team of 4, if we invest in them, then in my head the whole time I'm wondering which founder is going to get pushed out within the next 6 months, because it's just hard to have 4 co-founders, and it always happens. And a lot of companies fail due to founder conflict. So like 2 is probably ideal, 3 is fine. I've got 2 co-founders, there's 3 of us. We've also known each other for 17 years now, and we've worked together at multiple companies. We all went to Stanford together, so like we're all basically married at this point. And so for like our like investors, they're like, yeah, we have no question about your founding team and your ability to like work well together. But yeah, 2 or 3, and if you're just the one person and it's early on, I wouldn't stress about the giving up equity to a co-founder. I think it's hard to find a good co-founder, but it's absolutely worth it because it can go on forever. You're going to be in this company for such a long period of time, and a co-founder is so much more emotionally bought in to help you out than employees that you hire who will come and go. But a co-founder will hopefully be a very long period of time. So I wouldn't stress about the equity. I would just stress about finding someone who is a complement to you and someone who you can like actually be in the trenches with, which can be hard to suss out if you like just met them. So like co-founder dating to me just sounds kind of terrifying. It's like, whoa, we might be spending a decade together and we're going to meet for 30 minutes and be like, yeah, you're good enough. But yeah, try to get another. What is a good percent equity for board members? So equity for board members. So they're independent board members, and this doesn't happen to the seed round. This will usually happen at the Series A, where so what'll happen is you might have you'll have your Series A investor. Well, that can happen at the seed too. Like where the seed investor will take a board seat. One founder has a board seat, so there's a preferred seat, there's a common seat, and then as like a tiebreaker, they'll want to put in an independent board member. And so the question could be asking about how much do you give the independent board member? And that varies by size. There are a bunch of databases out there that have information on like equity and compensation generally for various roles, including independent board members. It's usually like 0.5% or 1%. It also depends on how impressive the independent board member is that you're bringing on and like what else they have going on. It's a negotiation like any other. And then if you're talking about the board members who are the investor, they don't get any additional equity. They get the equity they have because of the money they gave you, and they're taking a board seat or not, but they don't get any additional compensation for that. So that's like, from my point of view, like I like having our investors on our board because that means it's more likely they're going to do work for me. I'm not as concerned about their oversight, and I'm more concerned about one, having regular check-ins with them, which is nice just from like a sanity point of view, and then 2, like having them be helpful and having them be involved. So I like that. I don't have to pay anything for that, in addition to what I've already given them for the equity they have in the business. How important is networking when it comes to getting meetings? A warm intro is always better than a cold intro. One of the best sources of warm intros is from other founders who have recently raised. So our investors get most of their deal flow through their current and previous investments. And it doesn't cost the founder a lot to like forward your information on to one of their investors. And investors by and large don't expect that like that startup CEO is going to have done a ton of diligence on it. It's more like, oh, I met this person, they're reasonable, or like think to take a look at this. And it's much more likely that your information will get looked at if it comes from somebody that investor knows. If you really care about an investor, there's also a smart tactic you can use is to just kind of inundate them with intros. So it's actually fine if an investor has like multiple people sending them information about you. So like you might want to take a look at this. And like the way I heard it said by another investor was like, if one person tells me about it, great, that's one person. If 2 people tell me about it, great, that's 2 people. If 3 people tell me about this thing, that's everybody on the planet. It feels like it's just, so it's not like linear. And so if you really want an investor to meet with you, yeah, use everyone you can who you're connected to there. The team slide question. What happens when you have an awesome team but only one graduated from a top tier school? Should we list the one school for one person or omit the information altogether? That would look suspicious. Bob, Harvard, Joe. I don't think investors care a lot about the school pedigree, to be honest. Like sometimes it's like a signal of like this person's at least this smart. But that I'd say like is probably less important than like the narrative of your story or just like how much you care about it. When you look at any of our investors and their portfolios, it doesn't really skew towards like top schools. It's not like a thing they're caring about a lot. So I would just put like the information is relevant. I would say like it's like your technical co-founder didn't go to school. That's totally fine. A lot of the best engineers I know like didn't go to college, and there's amazing engineers. A lot of the ones that I worked with at Facebook were in that camp. So I would just say put the information there that's relevant, but don't feel like you have to hide anything. It's more about like what information do you want to put there that is relevant. It's not like top tier school or not. Oh, I answered that one. What did you find any patterns for what makes a bad team slide? What wouldn't make sense about a team page? That was the answer. There was around like not putting your best foot forward, or just not having enough information. So if it's just like your name and a picture, that's bad. Or if you're like putting your entire resume on the team page, that's probably bad. Yeah, so there are bad directions you can go with that. And so everyone's kind of a puzzle. Like, who is your founding team? What are you working on? Like, what doesn't make sense to put up there on there? The only thing I'd say that always makes sense to do is like have it linked to your LinkedIn profile, so they don't have to go like Google you or like search on LinkedIn for you. And so they can easily see if you have shared connections. And those shared connections actually mean a lot. Let's see. Oh, this is good. I like this voting system. So raising before website launch or after launch. So typically like pre-seed is for like before you've launched a product, and then like seed rounds where you're doing like 2 to 3 million, like you usually have a product in market. You might not be monetizing it yet, but like you've got a product and people are actually using it. And so for pre-seed, when you're thinking about like raising before or after launch, it is kind of a terrifying decision, because if you haven't launched yet, you can like, you know, like spin the dream, you know, it's like, this is gonna be huge, you're gonna miss out as soon as we launch it, they're gonna come, you know, and if it's post-launch, it's like, you actually have numbers to talk about. And so you'll often hear VCs say, push back and say like, oh, I'd love to keep in touch and let's chat like after you've launched, because it's a game where the VC wants to invest as late as possible and have the most information possible, unless it's a competitive deal and they're gonna miss out on it, and then they'll move sooner. So if someone says that to you, it means that your pitch wasn't quite good enough, and you try to iterate on something, and they also don't feel threatened. They don't feel like you're going to be able to raise from someone else and they're going to miss out on the deal. And so in terms of like when to launch, that's tough. It's especially tough to talk about that in the context of like raising money. I think it depends on your business and like when is the right time to launch and what information are you trying to get. There are some businesses where you actually do need to raise a lot of capital in order to make progress, and there's other companies where, you know what, speed to learning is the more important thing. Launch it, let's say it doesn't like take off like crazy, because that usually doesn't happen. Will it help you learn faster? Will it help you get to like a no, like we were wrong about this, or like there's really something here, we just have to tweak these sorts of things. And that's fine if you've got something in market and like, let's just say your traction side isn't super compelling. Don't have it be like a hockey stick, because it's not. Just say like, here's the information we've learned so far with this beta product in the market, and you can actually weave that into like a good story. So, you know, there are ways to mitigate it where it's not all or nothing depending on how you launch your product. Did you pursue your CS degree or MBA first? What made you shift and pursue the second? Well, I mean, everyone's a little different in what they do and how they do it. I studied computer science at Stanford. I started off in robots, and then they're very slow, and so then I went into computer science for a master's because I thought that was more fun. I still like robots a lot, but it is a very slow industry. And then I studied HCI, so I've always felt that there are a lot of things that can be built, but the question is like, what should be built? And then going back for business school, I remember in my interview, the woman was like, why do you want to go back to business school? And I was like, I just think it'd be really fun. She's like, that's not usually the answer I get from people. Like, usually they're more serious about their answer. But it was really fun. It's actually been super relevant for me at DocSend, being the CEO. Like, I do our financials. You know, it is. I actually did learn a lot. I didn't take any business classes in undergrad, so it just filled in a big knowledge gap. But I don't think people need to go to business school. Certainly, you can learn that information a lot of places. But it is also a lot of fun. I will say that. Can you talk about holding the voting rights as a founder? So voting rights here, that's a good question. Maybe it's being motivated by where, you know, like Facebook, like Mark controls everything at the company. It would be a longer discussion around like preferred rights and what's in your term sheet, because that's what it's really talking about. Every time you raise money, the new class of preferred stock is created that has certain rights specific to that class of stock. You as a founder only have common stock. So when people talk about the like terms and like what terms are in or out, terms are like interesting because it's not just like the amount of money and the price, it's also voting rights and like what can be, you know, what your rights are as a founder and as a common stockholder, and what rights your investors have as a preferred stockholder. And so that is a whole separate topic of conversation, and it is totally negotiable. So I will say, like, we haven't always taken the like highest term sheet. I picked our investors because I've really liked how they've structured their terms. And I do think if you get into a situation where you have multiple offers for money, don't take the highest offer. Take the offer that you think is from the person that you're going to work best with. And one of the signals of being founder friendly is like not sneaking into the term sheet things that are like non-standard or like really are in their favor. The good news is that if you're like in Silicon Valley fundraising, there are market norms for these sorts of things. On the East Coast, the norms are pretty different. Other countries, the norms are pretty different, but in Silicon Valley, it's like pretty narrow lanes of like what is market normal. And so if you're someone who's way outside of that, then like that's a big signal to you. Make sure you get a lawyer who also like does startup fundraising, because they'll know it is and isn't market. That's absolutely something everyone should do. Don't get like a random lawyer, because if they're negotiating back and forth, your deal might fall through. The investor thinks you're being unreasonable, you think they're being unreasonable. So that's all right. I think I might have time for like one more question on here. Let's see. Yeah, what is the best way to chart graph growth pre-revenue? And let me see the other ones, which one might be more interesting. Yeah, so I'll actually go with yeah, we'll do this one. At the seed stage, is having established revenue actually an advantage? It seems lofty projections with no existing revenue gain, like more attraction than we're making this much now and let's see what we could make. Has this been your experience? So these are actually two kind of related questions. Yeah, I still struggle with this. Like when we look at projecting revenue for DocSend, do you pick the thing that's like, wow, that's crazy, or you pick the thing that's like super conservative? Because like to some degree, like you don't know and they don't know. I think in terms of chart, like the less you can do like charting and predicting your future, the better, because if someone's asking a lot of questions about that, that means you haven't like sold them on the overall like idea. If like they're bought in that this is a huge like potential company and you're the right person to run it, then we don't know how big it's going to be and like what the exact slope is going to be, but it's going to be big. So like if they're asking detailed questions at the seed stage, that's a very bad sign, and that kind of goes for like traction as well. Like whatever your numbers are, like try to own it and massage it into a way that makes sense. But it's always better if you get them sold emotionally on it, and then that is just a thing to confirm that you've like done your research and they're there. All right. Well, I think that's it for time. So thank you, everyone.